Alright, here's the video for our first official snow day assignment of the year. For chapter 26.1, we're starting unit 6, so we're going to look at the transformation of the Trans-Mississippi West, so across the Mississippi. And so unit 6 is going to go through westward movement, the finishing part of westward movement, industrial America, and immigration, and talk about everything that changes in the United States to make life a little bit more like we know it today. So, as people start to move west, we call this area that's in yellow the Great American Desert. And we're going to see a lot of changing perspectives, because before, the West was, reserved for the Native Americans. Jackson moved them west, and the settlers who went out there found that the land they didn't really want to stay out in this yellow area, because it was a really bad environment. There are no trees on the Great Plain. It's a really harsh area. There's not a lot of rainfall, because you can see the mean annual rainfall is under 10 inches. And so the earliest settlers called it the Great American Desert, okay, or the Great American Wasteland. But then, and this is like pre-Civil War time period, but then during the Civil War, they passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which gives 160 acres to land to anyone that will move out there, and you pay a small fee, and you move your whole family, and you get that amount of land, and people move out there because, we as Americans really like free things. And so it really changes the perspective, and people are willing to move because it's free land, and it doesn't really matter that it's not enough land to make enough profit to really have your family survive. But it's still an opportunity, so those perspectives of this Great American Desert really change as people start to want to move westward. So we're going to look at the frontiers. Okay, we've already talked about some of these, but of course our first mining frontier, we start with the gold rush in 1848, okay, and then other large deposits are going to be discovered, like in the Rockies and Pikes Peak, which is in Colorado. The Comstock Lode, which is in Nevada, helps Nevada develop overnight, and we know that we get boom towns, okay, where, companies come in and people come in and build their little town around where they're mining. And we start with placer mining, which is where you're on the surface of the earth panning for gold in the river, okay, or you cut into the surface to get what you want. But then, of course, we know that a lot of the gold and other minerals are down in deep in the earth, and you need to have a lot of capital in order to get the machinery, in order to dig down and get that. So it's going to be really, like we talked about before, the big corporations who can go down and pull out the ore and really make a lot of money. And we know that, mine towns are not exactly the nicest of places. So here's, before the internet and online dating, this is how they tried to attract women. We know that the boom towns generally didn't have a lot of women in them. And it was not necessarily a nice place to live. So when the mines start to go deeper and we get into more of those corporations, starting with the mines, they start to bring professional miners from overseas. And the area where they get the most professional miners is going to be China. Okay, we also get some from Mexico and some from Chile and places like that. But China is the big place. And so when they start bringing in the Chinese, who are going to work for a lot cheaper than the naturalized Americans, the nativists start to argue that the Chinese are taking their jobs, similar to what happens with, immigration today. And so the Chinese are going to be subject to a lot of discrimination. And so you have a picture here on the screen that kind of shows one of the political cartoons from a group called the Working Man's Party of California, trying to advocate to kick the Chinese out of the United States to preserve jobs for the Americans. And so that's going to lead eventually to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which effectively bans immigration from China for decades. And so that's going to be a big effect of this first mining frontier. The next frontier is going to be the cattle frontier. Okay, cattle becomes a big business with the idea of the cowboys or the vaqueros, which is really interesting because a lot of the terminology that we have relating to the cattle business comes from Mexico and Spanish, because Mexico actually had the first cowboys. So vaqueros is the Spanish word for cowboy. And if you imagine a cowboy today, you think to your childhood, and usually you think of, there's one clean-shaven white guy wearing a white hat, and he's the good guy, who has a pretty white horse, and then there's the bad guy who's always, wears a black hat and doesn't shave for a few days, and he, marches into town kicking people out of the way and, slams down into the bar kind of thing. And so these are the cowboys that we think of, but that's not really what a lot of the cowboys look like. And the reason that we think of that is because of the cowboy movies in the 1930s, where you always had to have a good guy and a bad guy, and what you saw back then on TV was nothing like what the cowboys actually were, because the majority of the cowboys were either Mexicans or African American or Chinese. There were actually a lot of Chinese, so not like what you see in this picture from Dodge City, Kansas. Life of a cowboy was really rough. They made about $1 a day. They mostly lived outside, and they embarked on these long cattle drives. So if you look at the map and you see the trails, they would collect cattle from all of the ranches down in Texas, and then they would be charged with driving these hundreds or thousands of cattle up to the railroads, to meet the railroads where the cattle are then going to be put on the train cars to go to the big cities like Chicago. And there in Chicago, they're going to be sent to the slaughterhouses to become, steak for the East Coast. And so it becomes a big business because the ranchers figure out that, you can get a cow for $2 to $3 a head down in Texas, but if you send it to the city, to like New York City, you could make $30 to $50 a head. And so they've got to get the cows up to the railroads to get to the east to make a lot more money. So then you start to see all these trails created, and then of course you start to see cities created like Kansas City and Dodge City and all of those, Cheyenne, where, they're cow towns essentially, where the cattle trails meet the railroads. And so there's a huge boom in the cattle market. They're going to make a lot of money. But then there's a small problem because there's a drought, and so there's not enough land or water for the cattle. And so, that destroys a lot of their stock. And then the other thing that kind of destroys the trails is that within these areas where the trails are running through, you have all the homesteaders moving in at the same time, and the homesteaders start to say, wait, I don't want cattle running through my fields, trampling all of my new seed plantings. And so they start to fence it off, and because there are no trees, they use an invention by a guy named Joseph Glidden, called barbed wire. And that's probably the most important invention in settling the West, because you don't have trees to build fences. And so what you're going to do is use the barbed wire to keep your animals in, the other animals out, and especially the wrestlers, not W-R-E-S-T-L, but R-E-S-T-L, wrestlers, away from prevent them from stealing your cattle. So because the prices of the cattle go down, the herds are wiped out from drought, and the use of barbed wire, the cattle frontier is going to go bust eventually. But, cattle ranching is still a huge thing out in the Midwest, but now it's mostly corporate rather than the individual cattle ranches that we originally saw. So then our next frontier is going to be the farming frontier. We know the Homestead Act. We've talked about that, where you get 160 acres. And so they move out there. And they have to live there for 5 years, and then they get the land. And they originally called the settlers sod busters because you can't do anything unless you bring all of the wood to build your house from the east, which nobody had the money to do. You build your house out of what you have, which is sod, the top layer of dirt, which is kind of held together by the roots of the grass. So you can see the sod house here, and they brought the windows with them, or they bought them from a store. And they brought their little horse and buggy with them from the east, and they built their house. So even the roof is made out of sod from here. So it's kind of like they're living in dirt houses where, you've got bugs coming through the walls. And this is actually a really fancy dirt house because it actually has windows and things like that. A lot of them were actually built into the hillside, kind of like hobbit houses, and so you didn't have as many exterior walls and issues because they're living in Tornado Alley. They also have to use a new farming technique called dry farming. We know that if you go anywhere and you dig deep enough, you can find water. But you need to have that water in order to, for your seeds to grow. And so they had to go deep enough into the ground in order to get that water for the crops. And so the crop that finds the most success that they're going to use is eventually a Russian strain of wheat that's known from not Siberia, but the Russian plains. And it's really resilient. And so they bring this wheat over and they grow it on the U.S. Great Plains. And eventually the Great Plains, from the combination of dry farming, which is where you have the invention of the steel plow so you can dig deep enough to find the water, and the Russian wheat, we end up seeing the Great Plains become the breadbasket, essentially, of the world during World War I. So we end up going from just feeding the United States to feeding the rest of the world, too. And so make a note in your head that when we started class, we talked about the West as everything, kind of west of the Appalachian Mountains. And then, the West moved to everything west of the Mississippi. And now the Great Plains becomes the farming Midwest. And then the West is everything from the Rockies all the way to the California coast. So our definition of what is West has changed throughout the course. And from now on, we're going to say west, meaning like the West Coast Rockies and over to the west, as opposed to the Great Plains, which is going to become our Midwest now, as opposed to the old Northwest, like Minnesota and those areas. But we also start to see some issues with farm problems. Farmers begin increasing the size of their farms because 160 acres is not enough to grow enough to make a profit. And they need to make more money, so we start to move into a nation of large-scale farms. And then in order to pay for those farms and to get new land and all of that, they begin growing cash crops with higher prices. And they need to use more expensive machinery to plant and harvest the crops. And so we're going to start to see all of this, kind of grow. And we're going to start to see commercial stores emerge, like Macy's and everything that we'll talk about in chapter 24. And they send catalogs to the farmers, are advertising everything that you need that can be shipped to the farmers through the railroads. But with the larger farms and the new machines used, they produce more crops. And we know that more crops and more supply leads to falling prices. So we're going to see a lot of issues with how the farmers start with these cash crops, like corn and wheat become cash crops for them. Just like the South, when they became dependent on cotton and on those prices, they get pulled into that cycle of debt when the prices drop. And so the other problem is that we've moved into a global economic market. And so instead of the prices just being set by the American farmers in the American market, the prices are now set. We're competing with the grain fields of Russia and Argentina and other countries like this. And so we're not just dependent solely on the U.S. market. We have this global market that we have to compete for. And if everybody produces more in the world, then you have yet another rise in supply and a decrease in prices. And then you get further locked into. So you can see how in this little chart at the bottom, the corn production increases, millions of bushels produced on the left, and yet at the same time, the prices are kind of going crazy over here on the right as you see them drop down by 1900. And so you can see it's a reverse connection between the two, between price and supply. And then, of course, the railroads are a problem for the farmers as well because, the railroads are super expensive and they start charging a lot of money for the farmers to ship their goods. And so it gets to the point that it becomes so expensive to ship their harvest on the railroads that sometimes farmers are willing to just burn their entire harvest because they're going to lose more money if they ship their stuff on the railroad than if they just let it burn in the field where it is and try again next year. So it becomes a really big issue with the farms and farmers because prices are not set and there are a lot of things like taking money away from them. So looking at the West, Fredrick Jackson Turner is a historian at that time who gives a lecture in 1893 at the Chicago World Fair. And he starts talking about the significance of the frontier in American history. And he argues that the frontier had been the great social equalizer in American history. How in other countries around the world, if you had class inequalities, they didn't really have a way to ease the pressure between the classes. Okay, so think about France before the French Revolution. You have a lot of pressure between the different social classes, and yet there's nowhere for the peasants to go and have more opportunities because they don't have any extra land. They're full. And so Turner argues that the American frontier is that relief valve. If people didn't make it in the East, instead of rebelling or fighting against those that had more money, they just pick up and move west, where they have more opportunities. That's kind of becomes the American dream. So that becomes the social equalizer. And then he starts to talk about how the frontier forces Americans to become these rugged individuals, that you live off the land, you become creative and inventive, like McCormick, who invents the reaper, and Glidden, who invents barbed wire. And so this creates this American character and spirit that we even still hear about today. Okay, when politicians talk about this rugged individualism and exceptionalism of Americans, it goes all the way back to Turner's thesis, and this idea of what we become as we move to the frontier. And so one of the main arguments against his thesis is that if the frontier was the social valve, then if you were looking at population graphs, you would see that more people would move from the cities to the farms. And yet, when you look at demographics, the opposite actually happens. During this time period in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, more people move from farms to the cities. And so that's going to be, we don't see this huge flight. And so people still argue about this today of what does the frontier mean and how did the frontier help shape American culture and things like that. So that's our first video. Stay tuned for the second one.